That goes back. All right, listen, we have scenario number 4. All right? And so, the last few weeks, we have given you a homework assignment. And as you left last week, you should have picked up one. And we've been giving you a situation and a scenario to find out how you would respond. This is the one that we gave you last week. The situation is this. You're sitting in the waiting room at the mechanic shop watching the TV and waiting for your car to be serviced along with other customers waiting for their cars to be serviced. Now let me just ask, is that something you guys have participated in already? You guys have done that? Matt has cars that never break down.
No, I just don't show up till it's fixed. I drop it off and I leave.
I got it. All right, well, let's just pretend that you drop it off and you're waiting. All right? As you are all sitting in common volitional silence, the seemingly loud TV news program highlights a religious group trying to influence important moral legislation. The person sitting next to you says, "Haven't these people ever heard of separation of church and state? Those Christians are always trying to force their views on everyone else. You can't legislate morality. Why don't they just leave the rest of us alone? Other people are listening and you don't want to create a scene, but you feel like you must say something. What is your next move?" Yes, Caleb.
Well, when I got this, I didn't know what to say when I first read this.
Yeah.
And then, so Mom and I went home and started researching it. It was annoying us, right? And we looked in like all the founding documents or whatever, and they're not in the founding documents, except the word separation of church and state. It's actually in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Baptists in Virginia saying, we won't have a state-backed religion. And that is what they took in 1987. The Supreme Court took that sentence and then they made that law.
Good. Good. So it's good to know, right? One of the things that's awesome. Matter of fact, I talked to a trial attorney, this is years ago. His name was James Rabbit. He did his doctoral dissertation on the differences between the American Constitution and the Russian Constitution. As I'm sitting with him talking, he said, "Hey Doug, can you guess what the," and he said, "what the differences are?" And he said, "And I'll give you a hint. There's really only 2 differences between the American Constitution and the Russian Constitution." And I'm looking at him going, "Really? That's your question to me?" I said, "Hey Jim, I don't have a clue." He goes, "Well, I can give you a hint. The first one," he said, "is the separation of church and state. Our American Constitution doesn't have it in it. The Russian one does." So you're exactly right. So it's interesting that we base a lot of discussion politics-wise, political-wise, on the separation of church and state, and yet it's not stated in our Constitution. So I'm glad you picked up on that. So that's something, see, again, it's one of those things that when we talk about being prepared, when you get into the canoe, right? It's good to have your mind, heart, will, and spirit prepared. So it's good to know that, right? Because if you know that, what would you say to someone?
I probably wouldn't say anything anyways, but I would probably tell them what I told you, and then I would say, it's not in our Constitution, it's a mere ruling, and that's not what our founding fathers wanted.
Okay.
They just didn't want the church being mandated, they wanted people to have freedom of religion.
All right, good. Kevin?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I won't quote it correctly, but the state shall not mandate any specific religion or the free exercise thereof.
That's right.
That's what the actual Constitution says.
Right.
So you are free to exercise your religion.
That's right. That's right. Go ahead.
I guess Steph and I were talking about, I guess I would kind of evaluate the person to see which approach I would take. If they're type of thing, I would ask the questions of, if they're more, on like what Caleb says if they're more about very specifics, you know, so what do you know? You know, ask the question, what do you know about the separation of church and state?
Okay.
And can you explain to me, well, what is your interpretation, what is your knowledge of that?
Good.
And then take the fact of what it actually is.
Right. So if you heard what Derek said, you remember last week, I gave you one clarifying question, right, that can be extrapolated a number of ways. The first question we asked was, what do you mean by that? And that's exactly what Derek just asked, right? Knowing that what Caleb said is true, then the question is, hey, can you explain that to me? What you believe is the separation between church and state. Now what that does, that's that clarifying question that allows you to steer the conversation, but it allows us to be unoffensive, but we ask questions. Hey, can you tell me, what do you mean by that? Right? Can you explain what you believe the difference is?
And even in the morality part, you know, tired of people pushing, you know, religious people pushing the morality, their ideals. And,
Right.
and again, frame that in a way of, okay, if there wasn't laws on morality, can you tell me where would we be?
Well, we probably have men's swimming and women's events. Oh, sorry.
And winning.
And winning.
No! Don't get me on that one.
I think I would just tell them, you know, the separation of church and state is to prohibit the state from having, like, official interference in the church's affairs, not the other way around. That being said, if you were to die right now, you would be the church. And then I'd give a very long, intimidating pause.
With a specific look.
Nothing too specific.
All right. All right, good, good. Someone else, what would you do?
Again, try to steer the conversation maybe away. I think the first thing, the knee-jerk reaction is to talk about the separation of church and state. Because in America, in our culture, in our society, right, that's something that we are firm on, that we fight for, that we stand for. Whereas, I don't think that gets us anywhere closer to talking about Christ. Right? We can argue the Constitution all day long. The Constitution isn't a biblical document. I mean, yes, founding fathers may have had an intention for that, but it's not a biblical document. There's no power in that whatsoever. Right? Men uphold that. And so moving it to more of the moral issue, and you can ask them to say what they mean by that, or and again going into finding out what they want. But if we go into it trying to find holes in their separation of church and state argument, are we actually getting anywhere with faith and spirituality?
So it's interesting, right? What Brad brings up is what we call the straw man argument. And so what some people do is develop this structure, call it something, but it really isn't. And then you'll see that because it's a straw man, it eventually fails because it doesn't have strength to stand on. So you and I might say it simply that, okay, well, if we focus on the Constitution, that's just a smoke screen for what's really going on. That might be true, it might not be true. They might have legitimate concern. So it's good for us to address it, but know that we know that there's something more. Right? Good. Someone else? Yeah, John.
Well, I think that because he brought that up, that was his front for what he's typically, when Derek starts asking us questions about what do you mean by that, where are we going with this, he's blurted out something, but not always necessarily once you get the question back of what he exactly meant by that. His statement may fizzle away too. There may be not much substance to it because of it was just something that he could blurt out and see if he could get somebody to come back with a statement.
What we find out, and you'll find this out not only in conversations with people, but even in Christian circles. Politics means more than truth. And we have to be careful. Because sometimes we recognize that the political realm, we all live in it because we live under it. They rule over us. And they're making decisions, right, which I'll talk about in just a minute, that affect us morally. And because it affects us morally, we as Christians have some, and we ought to have, this inner ire that just sets us on edge. But it goes back to what Brad said. Is it really the politics of it? So let me give you 3 questions that came up in my mind as I read through this and encountered it, right? And again, I will give you the questions that I would ask, but these are questions as I read this, I go, okay, wait a minute, what about this? First one is, goes back to what Caleb said. Well, the separation of church and state. My first question is, do they really understand what the separation of church and state is? No, not so that you can embarrass them. Remember, we talked about that. It's not making a fool out of them because they don't know. But the question is, do they really understand what that means? So, I would do what Derek did. The question that I might ask is, you know, that's interesting. Can you clarify for me, which is, how did you say it? May you explain it for me, right? Can you clarify for me, what exactly does the separation of church and state mean? Somewhere in that conversation, you might need to ask this. Where in the Constitution are religious people excluded from the political process? Now, they might not like that question. Because it goes back to a second question in my mind. One, I would wonder if they really understand the statement, separate church and state. Second question is, as I read this, are these people saying that it's wrong for everyone to force their views on others, or just Christians? Now granted, the news is reporting a story, but they've basically said, well, those lousy Christians, right? So I might ask, so are you saying it's wrong for everyone to express their values, or just Christians? That's a good question. They might say, well, let me just ask, what might one of their answers be?
Yeah.
They might say yes. And if they say yes, then you say, well, because I happen to be a Christian, I just wonder, is it okay for me to express my opinion? If they say no, then say, then why are you so bothered by them doing that? Right? So that's, again, it's another question. Here's another question that kind of leads into that. If it's okay for everyone to express their views, or if it's just Christians that aren't allowed. It sounds contradictory, but if you get to someone like that, I would start by asking this question. Do you mind if I ask, do you vote? Why would I ask that question?
Because you're opposing your will.
See? So my follow-up question is, so would you expect that the person that you vote for, would you expect your candidate to pass laws that reflect your point of view? Isn't that what we do when we vote? So isn't that then basically an indirect way? Wouldn't that be the same thing as forcing your views on others? So the fact that you vote, isn't that you expressing your opinion and your view? So then how is that different than what they're doing on TV? So again, it's an indirect way to get them to see that they basically do the same thing. Does that make sense? You with me? Third thing, or if you want to take that voting thing to the end, you can even ask them, so is it okay for religious people to vote? Be ready for their answer. The third question I was thinking, because they basically said you can't legislate morality. Right? Have you ever heard that? You can't legislate morality. All right, here's a question in my mind. If I heard that, I would be thinking, well, isn't establishing law or rule, isn't that a foundation of deciding what is right and wrong? And isn't that morality? What law in our land is not based on a standard of right and wrong? But even that, it's a right and wrong, right? Just because you don't like it,
wrong.
just because you don't like it, right? It's right that you don't drive 65 through downtown New London, right? It's based on a right and a wrong. And there are probably reasons behind that. So, if I realize that every law that is passed is basically legislating morality. So what we would have to say is, every law legislates morality. Wouldn't that be true? So we can obviously say then, it's exactly opposite. Not only can they say that you can't legislate morality, wait a minute, that's everything that laws do. They do legislate morality. So we can help them to see that, ask questions. Make sense?
Yes.
All right. Now, let me get to that. When we begin to encounter different situations and scenarios, I hope you're beginning to see that it's good for us to formulate questions, right? We can make statements, but we have to earn the right to make statements. If we can ask questions and communicate to the person that we're in the canoe with, that we care, that we legitimately want to hear what they think, because if it's just us arguing, it's not about winning the debate, is it? Or winning the argument. We want to win the person. So with that in mind, what we started to do last week is we started looking at some of these methodologies, or what we call pathways to knowledge. There are lots of people who believe that you can get to truth a myriad of ways, right? One of those ways that we began last week was called agnosticism, right? And what is agnosticism? What's that?
Very large.
A very large word. That means what?
Isn't agnosticism like there is a belief in some sort of divine being that is uninvolved, and we don't have the ability to know that?
That's weak agnosticism, but remember there are two forms. There's weak agnosticism, which says we don't know that God exists. There's a strong form of agnosticism that says we can't know. Okay? And so if you need those papers, we've got it back there that kind of throws that out from last week. Now let me just get to some of this. I went very fast last week through the roots when we get to, and which by the way, it doesn't really, I don't care if you remember who these guys are, but some of what they said is huge because it forms and shapes the thought process behind agnosticism, okay? David Hume actually lived back in the 1700s. He said there were two things that were important in life to know knowledge. One is facts, and the second is definitions. What that means is how I explain the facts. Here's the problem with that. God is neither. If we're looking at proof, like 1 + 1 = 2, you can't prove God that way. That's mathematical proof. There are other proofs and evidences for God that an agnostic won't accept. Okay? If you say, God lives because he lives in my heart, what would an agnostic say?
Well, he doesn't live in mine.
See, they'll dismiss you right away, right? Because they'll say, but see, that's experience. It's not fact. Right? So your experience can be whatever it is. It's not based on fact. And fact that's proven. So, when David Hume was saying that, all of a sudden these people gravitated toward that. Oh. See, you can only know what you can prove. And that's how an agnostic thinks. So they're going to be heavy on you producing evidence. Make sense? Then comes Immanuel Kant. He came back a few years after David Hume. And this is, remember that chart I drew up on the board? He believed in two things, and he called it noumenon and phenomenon, and that's where we have knowledge going through your mind leads to reality, right? Well, what is real? Well, your mind filters everything that you think. So, we have knowledge over here, and all of us can agree on this. But we all can't agree on this. Because my mind is going to be filtered differently than your mind. Does that make sense? You with me? I'm trying to make it simple. All right, so here's the reality of agnostic. Because there is a strong agnostic that is really just one step away from atheism. And we'll talk about atheism in a few weeks. The strong agnostic takes what Hume and Immanuel Kant said and made it this entire ideology that makes you prove the physical existence of God. Right? And what they're going to try to do is get you to produce some kind of proof, not just over here in knowledge, but over here in reality. Right? How do you prove that God is real?
Nature.
Right? Now, keep in mind, that is true from Romans chapter 1. Yeah, Andy.
Well, and I might be jumping ahead of you here. I mean, if you're dealing with somebody like an agnostic and they say, there's no way for you to prove mathematically, scientifically that God exists, would it be like combative to say, well, can you prove mathematically or scientifically that it doesn't?
Yeah, and let me get to that because our response, which is next, if you have your outline. Agnosticism is self-defeating. Okay? And let's talk about why. Which, by the way, let me just get to this self-defeating argument. When we say self-defeating, and it's an argument that defeats itself, well, let me give you a couple of other examples. You tell me just the statement alone means that it can't be true. For instance, is this a self-defeating argument if I say, I love baseball? Is that self-defeating? No. Is it self-defeating if I say, my wife is the most beautiful woman in the whole world? Thank you. Thank you, Matt. It is not self-defeating, right? What about this statement? I cannot speak English.
True.
What made that self-defeating?
You're speaking.
What's that?
You just did it.
I just spoke in English. So you see how that statement is self-defeating. Agnosticism is self-defeating. How? Let me tell you how. They will say that they don't know or can't know about God and His existence. The reality is, they've already told you that there's one thing that you can know about God.
Oh, yeah.
The one thing that they told you is that God is unknowable. That's the first thing we can know about God. That's self-defeating. They've already told you God is unknowable. Okay, wait a minute. That statement is self-defeating. You already told me one thing I can know about God. Does that make sense? Are you with me there? Hello? Yes? Okay.
They know how to use his name in vain.
They do.
They never use Buddha or Hare Krishna.
Something happens, they never say, oh, Satan.
Yeah. Yeah.
We ought to start a club. Oh, Satan. Christians ought to use his name.
I'm not signing up for that. I like my chickens too much, dude.
Lucifer.
Well, just look at Hollywood and how cautious they are. They don't say anything about Muhammad. They don't have anything derogatory about, in their movies and all their stuff about other religions. They constantly tear down Christianity.
Yeah. Now, we might not go all that way with an agnostic, okay? Keep in mind, sometimes with a lot of these people, all we want to do is put a pebble in their shoe, right? Greg Corbin says that. And so, if we can keep in mind, if we can get them to see, wait a minute, there's one thing that you've already told me that we can know about God, and that is that He's unknowable, right?
Yeah, you start by saying, I agree with you. You both agree that God is unknowable. And then they're like,
Or, let's get to some of the questions. Let me just say this, because before I get to the questions, one thing you have to know about an agnostic, most of the times, especially strong agnostics, they're really not fair-minded people. They believe what they believe, and they're holding to it. And because you're going to ask them questions, just know that their response might be anger, okay? Because just knowing, if I'm a strong agnostic and you're telling me, or you're going to ask a question, you're going to say, hey, can I ask you a question? Do you really believe that we can't know anything about God? Which, by the way, that's the first question you're going to ask. Do you really believe that we can't know anything about God? And their obvious answer is going to be, yeah. My next question is, well, isn't that statement something that we can know about God? See, you're asking a question, and that question has an obvious answer. And that obvious answer is going to make them mad. To some, okay? But know this, if they're fair-minded, they're going to at least give you that much. And say, all right, listen, okay, I'll give you that. What you've basically done, if they do that, you've moved a strong agnostic to be a weak agnostic. Okay? Because now they might say, okay, well, all right, listen. Well, then there is one thing we can know about God. I'll give you that much. Right? So now they're telling you that they're a weak agnostic. Because now they're saying, well, then we just don't know if we can know anything else about God. If you're successful in getting him to that, then the questions come back, well, to a weak agnostic. Now, keep in mind, the second question to a weak agnostic is if you get a strong agnostic to accept it. But if you're starting with a weak agnostic, first question is, so do you really believe that we don't know anything about God? And if they say yes, then the second question is where the strong agnostic, if you can get him to be a weak agnostic, say, would you be willing to investigate with me to see if we can know something about God? See, you're not making declarations, you're asking. Would you be willing to do some research? Would you be willing to look with me at some of the evidence that God exists. Now, at that point, they might just realize, wait, you're asking me questions to show my hand. Because if I say, no, I'm not willing, right? And they might. Well, then they're really an agnostic that's blind and deaf and dumb. Then we've got a whole nother issue. Start asking questions. Yeah.
I mean, you could always ask, why do you believe God doesn't exist, or there is no God? And then you're trying to establish a foothold, some type of foundation to understand what their perspective is. So their knowledge might have been, well, I grew up in a church and I was mistreated, or I saw hypocrites, or whatever it might be, or I, knew something, or I never had any experience with this, or it could be a morality argument that they don't want to belong to a church because when they feel like they walk in, they just feel guilty the whole time. So you're asking questions, well, why don't you believe that God exists? So find out where their perspective is, so you can have a conversation.
Right.
Not to win the debate, but
Right.
the person.
And keep in mind, what Matt is asking would flow out of these questions, okay? Because if we can get them to begin to investigate some of the evidence for the existence of God, that's when you can say, well, tell me, how did you come to the place? And you remember that was the second question that we asked last week. The first one was, what did you mean by that? The second question is, how did you come to that conclusion? And that's the question that Matt is asking. Well, how did you come to the conclusion that you couldn't know God? That's a great question. Again, it doesn't allow you to just smash people. It allows you to communicate that you care. I want to know, how did you get to this point? Right? Yeah.
Is there a way, as you approach this, to sort of glean whether somebody is taking a position like this in some sort of actual pursuit of knowledge, where they want to know, but for whatever reason they've come to the conclusion that they don't or they can't, versus somebody who arrives at this position as a means of relieving themselves of accountability?
Yes.
Like how do you figure out which one you're dealing with? Because I would assume the question would kind of change.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's a simple answer, Andy. Because your question was, how do we glean that? Right? The obvious answer has to be listening. Okay? And matter of fact, your homework assignment for next week is going to be an exercise in listening. So, but the answer to that is, yeah, if I'm going to listen, and I'm going to listen well, I'll be able to tell whether their questions or their responses are legit, if they're well thought through, and what what has led them to these conclusions. Sometimes they're just hiding behind maybe a propaganda. Well, they just heard someone else say it. And so because, Barry said it, and Matt said it, and Derek said it, and Caleb said it, well then, it has to be true, because, they're saying it. Right? Maybe, ABC News said it. Whatever. And so that might be the basis of what they believe. Not because they've investigated it, not because they've really delved into it at all, but that's where, again, as we ask questions, as we get to know them, we'll find out, which is why the first question to a weak or a strong agnostic is, do you really believe that we can't know about God? Because if you were to can't, then obviously you're addressing the strong agnostic. Yeah.
Isn't the crux of all these beliefs hurt? Because they were hurt either by a person, a church, whatever, interaction, expectation they had that were unmet, and they have this belief. Because I can't think of any people who had a really good Christian upbringing that, really connected with God and everything, that turned to a different religion. Like,
Yeah, I can't say.
I think we need to take these people and realize that there's some hurt in there.
Yeah, I can't say all,
Okay.
but some.
Okay.
Because I don't think everyone starts with truth. And if we start with truth and then been deceived from the truth, then I end up being hurt, right? there are some people who might be raised in a home, never been exposed to truth. And they believe it because mom and dad said so. Uncle Joe said so. Aunt Susie, well, she's sweet, she'll never lie to anybody. I have to believe what Aunt Susie believes. So they might not necessarily have the hurt that you're talking about.
Or the
But they've
unmet
been-
expectation, like, well, you know, I've never heard about God, and this is just what they tell me I should believe or whatever.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about an agnostic, right, there's something in their background that led them to believe that this is true. We don't want to assume that it was hurt and pain, because it might not be. It might just be confusion. I've not been exposed to truth. No one. And you'd be surprised how many people have never been told about Jesus. You're like, really? How many churches? We're saturated with truth, but how many people haven't heard about Jesus? In our alpha groups, just recently, we've had people say, why have I never heard about this? And we're like, what? How many Bibles are on our shelves? How many churches have we gone to? And there's people out there who've never heard about who Jesus is and what he's done for us. Yeah, there are. So it could be that there's not that kind of pain in the past where someone is turned against Jesus like that. Could just be like some confusion where I've not been exposed to it.
Would agnostics put truth into the same category as God? Like, in their mindset, would
No,
they?
they can't.
They can't.
They can't because they don't believe there is a God. He doesn't exist. So if you remember this flow chart with the filter of our mind, this is knowledge and this leads to reality, and reality is truth.
Yeah, a deeper part of that illustration that he's talking about is where experiences and the things that you know, the knowledge, leads to your beliefs, which leads to your actions. And the only way you can change any of those actions is to change your experience, which
I guess I
often
should-
is very difficult.
I guess I should have worded that as absolute truth. Like, would they say that there is?
No. No, they won't.
So,
And let me go back, because let me change some of the words that Matt uses. They don't want to make experience the basis for truth, right? Because then it's your word versus mine. So it's not just experience, right? It's knowledge. So it's based on what we know. Right. You just don't know enough, right? And once you know enough, and we'll talk about experientialism, because that's where experience comes in. But then it's filtered through our mind. See, the trouble is your mind doesn't work.
I hear that.
Right? That's
Or they'll take you down the path that says, well, your experience has led you to the knowledge that you need a crutch, which is why you need Christianity. I hear that a lot. So you need this because your experience in life has made you to the point where you need something to believe in that is just a crutch for your life. Congratulations, and then they walk away.
Yeah. Now keep in mind, what Matt's describing isn't agnosticism. It's experientialism. And we'll get to that in just a few weeks. Because they sound the same. They kind of, listen, all of these manifest themselves in similar ways. But an agnostic really goes at knowledge, right? The word, if you remember in the definition, means no or non, gnosis is knowledge. They base everything on what they know or don't know. Don't give me your experience crap. And that's what they'll tell you. Now, they might not say exactly like that, right? But they'll say, listen, if you're telling me your experience, you're already barking at the wrong tree. I want to know what's this knowledge. How much can we know? And I believe you can't know. Or I believe you don't know about God. Make sense?
So everything has to be like tangible, quantifiable.
Right, and that's why I say, yeah, because when we go back to what David Hume said, right, it's all about facts and definitions about those facts, right? That's what's important to an agnostic. I want to be able to, you can prove it. 1 + 1 = 2. See, the truth is, I've got 2 pencils. I can prove that if I take this 1 pencil and add this other pencil, I have 2 pencils, right? And that's what the proof they're after.
But they don't believe in absolute truth.
No.
Okay.
But that's the point. That's the point, right? Because that's what we ask questions. That's what we want them to get to. Right? Yeah.
I would say the root of all these conversations is the canoe trip. So do you already know the person? Did you just meet them on the plane or on the bus or at the store? How do you develop a relationship with them? Because if you're going to lead anybody down a canoe trip path, you can't do it in 5 minutes. This is like 5 days to 50 days to 5 years sometimes.
Yeah.
And you have to have that relationship before you can really ask honest, in-depth questions
Yeah.
sometimes.
And if you're in a quick canoe trip, you're sitting in a dentist office, or you're on an airplane flight, right? The only thing you might be able to do is just put a small pebble in your shoe.
Yep.
You might not lead them all the way to the destination, but that's okay. Pebbles are good, right? But if we're going to continue a relationship with an agnostic, right, it's earning the right to be heard. Here are some of the questions you ask, right? I'm going to give you all of them just in case I didn't. To a strong agnostic, do you really believe that we cannot know anything about God? I told you that one, right?
Yeah.
Another question. Isn't that statement something we can know about God? And just know that he goes, well, what do you mean by that? Well, you just told me that God is unknowable. Well, that's one thing we can know about God. So be ready to describe that. Another question. If we can't know anything about God, then we can't know that he's unknowable. Right?
He doesn't exist. How can you even talk about him?
Right. The fourth question, if we can know at least one thing about God, would you be willing to consider that there may be more?
Say it again.
If we can know at least one thing about God, would you be willing to consider that there may be more? Now, what are we trying to do there? We're trying to give a strong agnostic to be a weak agnostic. And why is that important? To move them from strong agnosticism to weak.
Because if they're willing to consider the notion that there may be a flaw in their thought process,
Right.
then ideally you get the weak agnostic to
Begin to research. Again, you want them to begin to research some of the evidence. If they're open to that, that's why it's important to get a strong agnostic to be a weak agnostic. The questions to a weak agnostic. So, do you really think that we don't know anything about God? A weak agnostic will admit that there is one thing that we can't know about God, or that we can know, and that is that he's unknowable. They'll give you that. Then we get to the next two questions. Would you be willing to investigate with me to see if we can know something else? Right? Or the third one, would you be willing to search the evidence about the existence of God? Now, keep in mind, if they say yes, then you've earned the right to say, well, listen, the next time we meet and we're going down the canoe trip, we want to arrive at truth at the first checkpoint, right? So now you can do a lot of research and you can bring back all of these things that prove that God exists, right? That's when it's good, because you can use Romans chapter 1. Listen, there are a lot of things that prove God exists. Look at nature. There's order. And you can go to all kinds of things. And you might not have to quote, well, Romans chapter 1 says this. But there are a lot of other evidences. So do your research and then come back and then you can talk about them.
I think in our culture, most people do not believe that there's not a God. We had a PhD chemist that worked for us that was claimed to be an atheist.
Yeah.
And one day we were walking through the plant and I was asking him about the technician that worked for him. I said, well, where's Jim today? And he said, well, he's really got a bad case of the flu and he didn't come into the plant. Thank God he didn't come because I didn't want to catch it. I'm like, and he looked at me and like, oh boy, he knew he started. Got him, you know.
Yeah.
But he is an atheist, but he, thank God he didn't come.
That's right. That's right. And when we get to atheism, you'll see how we slide them into agnosticism, and from strong agnosticism to weak agnosticism, to get them to search for the evidence of God. Right? Yeah.
My dad was agnostic, so he was all about knowledge, in the wrong way. I remember in 9th and 10th grade biology, actually, I gave a speech about it, and I poured myself into it because I thought that's what was correct. Then at 19 became a Christian, and in my own mind, then I had to search for knowledge on the existence of God and where He was.
Keep in mind, what we know is not what they know, okay? We already know Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We know that. He's the truth. So knowing that, we've already got one leg up, but we want to ask questions that lead them to the place where they can encounter, right? The truth that God exists and what He came to do for them. So to an agnostic, right, it's all about knowledge. Let's go to rationalism, and we'll begin looking at this. Rationalism is an ideology that basically says, if it's logical, it must be true. All right? Now, they're kind of similar to an agnostic. They will say that reason rather than experience is the foundation of knowledge. Okay? We'll talk about experientialism next time. But rationalism says it's not about experience, it's about reason. Okay? It has to be logical. It has to make sense. The definition of rationalism, I'm going to give you a long one. Okay? Rationalism is a belief or theory that opinions and actions should be based on reason and knowledge rather than on religious belief or emotional response.
That's too much.
I'm gonna write that down.
I told you it's going to be a long one.
I got belief down.
Wait, did I not say that? What was that?
I got belief down.
Okay. A belief or theory that opinions and actions should be based on reason and knowledge rather than what's the matter? Now you don't want it? Now you're complaining because I'm slowing down. Rather than on religious belief or emotional response. Now listen, let's take that definition apart real quick. All right, listen. It is a method of knowledge. We're talking about pathways of knowledge. There are people who believe that rationalism, what you believe, has to make sense. Okay? Listen, there are going to be people who believe that your Christian beliefs don't make sense. Most of us don't know how to answer that. Because we'll say, well, it's all about faith. And a rationalist will puke all over you. Because they're going to say to you, your faith isn't enough. And you're going to go, oh, what do I do now? If you don't have a way to answer them, you just lost the person that's in your canoe. They're now swimming down the stream. Because they're not in your canoe anymore. Does that make sense? You with me there? Right, so it's a method of knowledge, but it's all about this idea of logic. Now listen, you and I have to be convinced that our Christian faith is logical. If you're not convinced of that, you're already going to be, your canoe is going to be doing this. Now you're going to make it downstream, but man, you're going to be dizzy. Okay? Here's what's common to a rationalist. They have an argument, or an emphasis, I should say, on argument and evidence. They love to argue with you. They love to talk about what makes sense. They love to talk about what's rational and what is reasonable. Let me give you some roots. Again, these people are irrelevant as far as, what we honestly, you don't need to impress anyone. But there was a guy by the name of David Anselm, lived all the way back in 1033. So that's when he was born. He had this idea that there is nothing greater And there's no one greater than what can be conceived in your mind.
That's the whole ticket to the whole thing, is God is bigger than we are.
Yeah.
To me, all these pieces that you're talking about are those people who are trying to bring the whole situation to their controllable level.
Yeah. And what you'll find out is their definition of God isn't our definition of God. They'll dummy him down to become a human, and maybe even the best of all the human characteristics. But that can't be true, right? So, here's David Anselm. He talked about there might be this idea of God, but it's only this God that can be conceived in our minds. Right? So it's a natural version, it can't be supernatural. Our definition of God might be in your mind and my mind, but what they want to do is find a way to bring that God out of our minds into reality. So that, is it true that, well, Dom believes that there's a God and it's in his mind, but Kylie, man, her mind, whoo, she's got this idea of God that's far different than Dom's, and quite honestly, I like her version better. And so what idea that's in your mind about God do I want to bring into reality? And so a rationalist is going to say, well, this one makes the most sense, so that's what I believe. Keep in mind, it's very, very subjective. Well, if we can get them to be objective, that's part of the goal. Then there's a guy by the name of Rene Descartes. He was the original person that said, I think, therefore I am. The highest process of knowledge and truth is what you and I can think. Okay? So the proof of my existence is the fact that I can have thought. And if you can think, that's all you need. Obviously, you can see how, well, I won't say that. Let me get to some basic problems of rationalism. We've got 3 minutes. And much, by the way, I think that clock's a little bit ahead. Is that true? Can anybody tell me if that's right?
It must be 1 minute.
2 minutes? Okay, all right. Let me just give you the basic problem of rationalism. The first problem of rationalism, what is logical may not be true. Okay? Just because it seems to make sense does not necessarily mean that it is. Let me give you an example. If I make a statement, and it may be true, if I say all pastors pray, my second statement may also be true. Austin prays.
Therefore, he's a pastor.
Conclusion, therefore, Austin is a pastor. Right? But listen, but do you see how rationalism, though it makes sense, if I say all pastors pray, well then Austin prays, well then Austin must be a pastor. It's logical, but is it true? He might be in the process of becoming a pastor, but is he a pastor? No. So just because it's logical doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. There's a difference between truth and reason. Now, truth ought to be logical, but there are things that are logical that aren't true. Can anybody think of an example? Let me give you one that we celebrate at Christmas time. Santa Claus. Is that logical? Well, yeah, it makes sense. There's some dude in some red outfit that brings toys to kids. We've all bought into that. We were told to believe in that. He comes down the chimney. I don't know how this fat guy makes it down a skinny chimney, but he does. And depends on which Hallmark movie you watch is how he does it. But listen, we explain it, don't we? Oh, well, he was a saint. He's St. Nicholas, and he's got this. We've got an entire belief based on something that's logical, but it's not true. Does that make sense? Are you with me there? So just because it's logical doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Now, keep in mind, sometimes everything that is true might not be logical. So we say it backwards. Let me ask you this. We say God is love, right? Someone who doesn't believe in God would ask this question, and it was one of the questions I asked in here. Then why is there so much suffering in the world? See, in their mind, it's illogical for you to tell me that God is love, and yet a God that is loving can't be loving if he allows suffering. We're going to talk about that actually in a couple Sundays. So let me pause that right there. Yeah.
So are rationalists the crowd that would levy the argument of, like, why would God create the world just to know that it was going to break, and then he would have to use his son to rescue it? They would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why?
Yeah.
It's not logical. Why would God even do that to begin with?
A rationalist might not even assume God. Okay? Because they might even say God doesn't make sense. Because if you can't reason God out for them, then God doesn't exist. So if you can get them to believe that there is a God, well, then it doesn't make sense to send his son. They might follow that, but you got to get them to that point. Right. So, yeah, good. Any questions, comments about this? We'll pick up here next time. Anything about agnosticism or the beginning of rationalism? Now listen, what I'm doing, and I hope you understand, I'm not necessarily saying that all of these people are evil and we need to get out our big spiritual billy club and beat the stew out of them. That's not it. Okay? What I'm saying is I want you to understand that these are some of the people you're going to be in the canoe with. And if you don't understand what they're thinking and how they process what they believe, then you won't know what to ask. You won't know how to get them to checkpoint number 1. Because it's all about truth. Make sense? Alright, so let me give you your homework, and we'll pick up here with rationalism next time. We'll talk about some common statements, and then questions to ask a rationalist. Here's your homework assignment. This week, between now and next Sunday, and don't do it next Sunday morning, I will know if you're lying. Between now and next Sunday, I want you to have a conversation with someone that you don't know. It can be at the grocery store, it can be at the bank, it can be wherever, okay? The prerequisite is, okay, it doesn't matter whether you know them or don't know them. So you can already have a relationship with them. So if you do, what you want to do is begin to have a conversation with them. And in that conversation, I want you to listen for things like we did in these scenarios. Instead of having it on paper so now you can look at it and study it, I want you to listen to someone this week and pick up on things that you're thinking, wait a minute, that didn't sound right. That didn't sound like truth. Okay? When you're done having that conversation, go back and just write down what they said and why you think that was a question mark in your mind. Make sense? You with me? Okay. That's all I want you to do. Easy homework. Go talk to someone, listen to what they say or what they don't say, as the case may be, and see if there's anything that triggers in your mind that says, wait a minute, that just didn't sound right. And maybe it's an agnostic or maybe it's a rationalist that we've already learned about, right? At least to this point. You know, wait a minute, that didn't sound right. And then as we begin the class next week, I want you to tell me the conversation you had and what you heard that didn't sound right. Sound good? Any questions about that?
What if it's another